Human lever. A captured Italian naval lieutenant sketched a harbor trap he was never meant to draw. Within a few weeks, its reach spanned from Gibraltar to Alexandria, and Decima MS swimmer doctrine stopped working where the water turned shallow. Subscribe for restrained, evidence-first World War II investigations, new videos every day. Dawn, early March of 1943. Gibraltar Bay, South Mole, light easterly Levante, low cloud, sea state slight. On the chart pinned to a corkboard in the boom defense hut, the old rule was simple and trusted. Anti-submarine nets, patrol boats on clockwise loops, searchlights sweeping the surface, and depth charges set for anything deeper than a man. The nets were measured for hulls, not ribs. The watches were trained for periscopes, not the faint wake of a man's head in slack water. That rule had held since the winter after Alexandria. The rupture came out of a locked steel door below the signal tower at HMS Cormorant, the Royal Navy's shore base. A Decima Flottiglia MS swimmer, Sottotenente di Vascello, late 20s, sat at a table with a blank maintenance card and a soft pencil. He had been taken off a prison transport from Algiers after a failed attempt to mine shipping alongside the Quai de Falaise the previous November. His chain of custody read like a route map: Bougie field cage to Algiers, harbor cell to Gibraltar. Classified as a saboteur, he expected a hanging board, not paper. Instead, he was handed a request: show how he'd been trained to beat a boom. He drew water first, then wire. He marked the slack water windows when tidal set gave least noise around the net's lower belly. He penciled in the depth a swimmer kept to slip below a chain link without scraping, roughly 1.5 arm lengths under the lowest cable, a little deeper at the sinkers. He sketched the breathing set profile and the swimmer's compass strokes against a harbor light. Finally, he flipped the card and drew what he feared: a curtain of thin trip lines suspended just above swimmer depth, each line carrying a fist-sized scare charge, cast in a cheap tin, fused not for submarines, but for men, detonating at a shallow setting with a kill zone of roughly 4 paces. A petty officer from the Gibraltar Boom Defense Unit took the card upstairs. By mid-morning, the unit had a test rig. They borrowed spare mooring wire of small gauge from a harbor lighter, crimped leads to a dozen tins filled with cast explosive left over from anti-sabotage grenades, and slung the assembly from a workboat between 2 pilings along the South Mole. Burst height was set using a simple knot ladder, shallow enough to disrupt lungs and instruments, not so deep as to lift silt and blind sentries. On the quay wall, a signalman traced the timing with a wristwatch. From first splash to first detonation, a count of 7. The boom officer logged it in the harbor defense book as a shallow swimmer array. The immediate tactical metric was plain enough to fit in a margin. Charges spaced every 10 paces along the interface of the net, trip lines staggered vertically by half a pace to catch a chest, not a fin, and a drill for night shifts to reset blown lines with pre-tied loops. The watch bill changed that afternoon. Motor launches would still circle, but each passed now through 2 marker tins filled with fluorescein dye into the water up current of the net, ready to stain any disturbed patch neon for a few minutes under a shaded lamp. The array turned an invisible corridor into a narrow, noisy gauntlet. Witness objects fixed the moment in the record. The day's logline at HMS Cormorant noted, "Trial of swimmer deterrent, South Mole, satisfactory." A boom defense maintenance card carried the lieutenant's pencil diagram beside a part number scrawled from habit. An aerial reconnaissance photo shot later that week by a Fleet Air Arm Anson caught the faint pattern of floats inside the net, dots hardly larger than shoeboxes. A cargo manifest from the ordnance store listed a small but unusual transfer: tins, caps, and quick match cord, quantities modest but recurring. None of it looked like a new weapon. It read like a repairable fence. Why the Royal Navy moved an Italian from a cell to a drawing table was not sentiment, it was arithmetic. Since Ceuta Bay and Alexandria, swimmer-delivered limpet mines had scored high with low material cost. Nets set for hulls did not register men. Patrol boats could not be everywhere inshore at once. The lieutenant's sketch solved a geometry problem. If a swimmer has to choose one depth, force him into a band where contact is likely and punishment is instant. For the watchkeepers, a burst at shallow setting did more than injure. It fixed a location. The blast made a circle of sound the guard boat could run down, dropping additional light tins to paint the slick for the next pass. The authorization was local, but clean. A commander of boom defense signed a single sheet, tasking his artificers to fabricate arrays for 2 inner harbor sectors before nightfall, then to expand to 3 more by the next spring tide. He borrowed a pair of army sappers to help with crimping and splicing. Their mine notebooks contributed the delay fuse settings, set in whole second steps to prevent sympathetic detonations from running a line. A quiet memo went by pouch to the port admiral at Alexandria. Description, spacing, suggested materials, and a caution about false positives from floating weed. Nothing in the language sounded proud. It read like plumbers talking to plumbers. That night, with the Levante lifting light chop, the first array went live. The sentries on the mole were briefed to hold fire until after a burst, then to rake the plume line with a fixed number of rounds at measured intervals, not continuous spray. A fair-mile launch adjusted its circuit to cut inside the net every quarter hour and test for dye patches in the lee of the moorings. The kill zone was small, 4 paces at most, but the shock propagated further, startling fish and bringing a milky boil to the surface that even a tired eye could catch. By morning, the rule had changed on a single stretch of wall. Harbor defense, once measured by how well it kept steel hulls out, now counted how fast it made a man let go of a magnet. The lieutenant, kept under guard and fed like any other prisoner, watched his own shortcuts turned into triggers. He was not spared uncertainty. Officially, he was still a captured saboteur whose status was unresolved. Unofficially, he had become a draftsman whose pencil carried more weight than a rope end. One measurable effect appeared within days. The dye tins, tossed up current as doctrine, began to leave faint streaks on incoming tide where no boats had passed. The boom crew logged the pattern and shifted one array to sit under the streak's edge, closing a route that had been guessed but never proven. A second effect was less welcome. A shallow burst would sometimes trip a small cascade along a line, wasting 2 charges for 1 contact. The maintenance card showed a fix within a week, alternate fuses with a half-second offset to cut sympathetic fire. Continuous improvement was not a slogan on a board, it was a line of pencil marks on cards that smelled of cordite. The human lever had a name in the guard ledger, though the film canisters would later list him as the Italian. Frey. He had signed nothing formal. He had simply drawn what he knew and watched the harbor crews turn it into a repairable system. Cheap tins, quick to reset, hard to spot underwater, and tuned to the depth a man must hold when he swims under a boom. The decision to use his knowledge did not make a headline, and it did not need Admiralty paper to begin. It was a dockyard choice at one base on one morning, executed with parts already to hand. By the week's end, the corkboard map carried 5 small pencil rectangles inside the net line, each labeled with a time and a spacing and a note to check knots. A teleprinter copy of the HMS Cormorant logline went in the pouch to Alexandria and Haifa. A short decoded summary from the Mediterranean signals room, fielding chatter picked up in Spanish harbors, hinted that Decima MAS planners had begun advising their men to sit deeper and hold breath through any surface crack. That adaptation looked tidy on paper. In water, it bent them lower into a lattice designed to feel for chests, not fins. The contradiction closing the act was quiet. The new arrays created noise signatures that sometimes masked the thump of a small craft nosing the inner wall, and the die could mark a harmless eddy as surely as a man. The system worked, but it was not a cure-all. It needed drills, spacing, and a habit of measuring, not assuming. And it would not stay in Gibraltar alone. The pouch copies were already moving east, and Alexandria's boom crews had tins and cord waiting on their benches. The paper trail began the same day the first array worked. A 1-page memo from the Gibraltar Port War Signal Station, typed in block capitals, went into the diplomatic pouch. It named 3 parts and 1 drill. Thin trip lines at swimmer depth, small scare charges set shallow, dye tins thrown up current on a fixed minute schedule, and a rule for launches to cut inside the net after any burst. The copy list ran to Alexandria, Haifa, and Malta. A second sheet, handwritten by the boom artificer, added spacing in plain words. 1 charge every 10 paces, 1 trip line every half pace in depth, not markers for night work. The witness objects multiplied. A pouch receipt, a maintenance card with a sketch, and a dockyard tally showing tins, fuses, and cord issued in small batches over a string of days. Authorization moved one step up without ceremony. A flag officer in Gibraltar wrote a short signal to the commander-in-chief, Mediterranean. Local anti-swimmer measure trialed, materials commonplace, recommend immediate adoption in inner harbors. No special code name, no fanfare. What mattered was that every big Mediterranean port had nets and men, and all could improvise wire and tins. Production did not need a factory. The only items in short supply were fuses calibrated for very shallow water. An ordnance store in Alexandria stamped out a few hundred using existing detonators and a rubber washer to keep water out. A production tally written in soft pencil, page top smudged with sweat, logged a goal of 50 sets per harbor by the next new moon. Transport was local and simple. In Alexandria, tins and fuses rode on a harbor lighter from the ordnance shed to the boom vessels. In Haifa, boxes went by rail from the inland depot to the quay, recorded by a short rail manifest that looked like any other pallet of small stores. Malta's Grand Harbor used a ferry scow to bring loops and tins to the breakwater cranes. Each movement left paper, a ferry manifest with crate counts, a key foreman's chalk marks, a return slip from the boom crew with "fitted" noted in the margin. The system scaled because it was cheap and did not care about paint or polish. It asked only for wire, cord, and hands. The doctrine, when written down at fleet level a few weeks later, read like a checklist. Keep the net for hulls. Add a narrow belt for men, set just inside the net where a swimmer must pass to reach a ship. Stagger the trip lines in depth so a man cannot slip between them without feeling one across his chest or arms. Use small charges, not to kill by blast, but to force a man to let go, to make noise in a tight circle, and to mark the patch for a launch to investigate. Throw dye up current at fixed times, not at random. Keep spare loops pre-tied and replace any blown segment at once. None of this was pretty, and none of it needed new training commands. Harbor crews understood knots, loops, spacing, and timing. They lived by them. Reliability was measured in 2 plain numbers, written in a lieutenant's pocketbook after a week of drills with volunteer divers at Gibraltar. In 3 attempts out of 5, the array tripped at least once when a trained diver tried to pass under the net at swimmer depth. Dye marked the water patch in 2 out of 3 bursts for at least 1 minute. The numbers improved as crews learned where eddies collected weed and pushed the arrays a little inboard or outboard to sit in cleaner flow. By the end of the month, a boom officer at Malta wrote that false bursts from weed had dropped from about 1 in 5 to roughly 1 in 7 after they stopped tying lines to a smooth bar and instead hung them from short, knotted stubs that held their place better in chop. Case Study 1 was a defensive hold at Alexandria, late April of 1943. Weather calm, visibility fair. 2 fair-mile launches ran the inner loop while a Polish destroyer lay at the western arm, boilers warm for convoy escort. At just after midnight, a single shallow burst sounded along the inner face of the net, about 50 paces south of the coal hulk. The watchbill called for a pause of 3 breaths, long enough to stop firing blind, then a measured rake with fixed intervals. Dye thrown up current stained a narrow strip under the signal tower light. A launch cut across and dropped a second marker tin. In the foam, the crew hauled up a rebreather set, torn straps still wet. The ship's logline noted no damage and a 1-hour stand down while trip lines were reset. The measurable effect was simple. No ship was touched, and a launch recovered gear that confirmed a serious attempt rather than a stray fish. A unit AAR page filed that dawn, laid out spacing corrections, and praised the belt for giving them a fixed point to work from, not a guess along a long wall. Case Study 2 hinged on terrain at Haifa, mid-May of 1943. Haifa's breakwater created a pocket of sluggish water down the inner face. Sewage outflow and weed created false positives. The boom team hung an array and got a run of shallow bursts with no evidence of swimmers. The limitation forced a change. They shifted the array 10 paces off the wall onto a set of small outriggers and added 2 simple rattles, empty fuel tins with gravel inside, on dropper lines between charges. Those rattles sounded only when a body brushed through. Weed that eased along the lines did not hit them hard enough to ring. A week later, during a night with the same tide and smell, a burst came with a clear rattle and a dye patch that slid forward in a way weed never does. A launch ran the mark and found a cut limit near the mooring of a Greek freighter, straps torn, adhesive still tacky. The measurable effect was less about numbers and more about a filter, the outboard shift and the rattle-cut false bursts to almost none, and gave watchkeepers confidence to move without waiting for a second clue. Case Study 3 showed a doctrine pivot at Malta's Grand Harbor, early June of 1943. Malta had long layered defenses at the entrance. The new arrays allowed a shift in emphasis. Instead of pouring effort into the outer boom alone, the harbor crews built sleeves around high-value moorings inside, short arcs of trip lines and tin charges slung from small buoys near the quays where tankers berthed. The sleeve did not try to seal the whole harbor. It made narrow traps right where men would need to slow down and look up. On a humid night, just past the first quarter moon, a shallow burst went off near a tanker's bow chock. The sleeve was so close to the target that the response took half the time of an outer boom run. No damage followed. In the morning, a diver from the boom crew found 2 fragments of a swimmer's knife near the tripline knots. The measurable effect was recorded in a range table clipped to the sleeve plan. Average response time reduced from about 4 minutes to roughly 2, distance to run cut by about half, and no evidence of sympathetic bursts along the arc. Within a fortnight, sleeves ringed 2 more high-value berths. Opponents adapted, but the adaptations underperformed against the layered system. Italian swimmer doctrine told men to hold deeper for a few strokes after any surface noise. That placed bodies right where the staggered lines sat. Some carried short knives to cut trip lines. Cutting did 2 things the crews counted on. It slackened a segment and made the die spread in a small, unnatural tongue that watchkeepers learned to read, and it removed one loop while leaving others untouched, so the next line still fired. A few teams shifted to slow bottom creep, moving along the seabed to avoid the lines entirely. That worked only in clean water and cost time. The sleeves at Malta punished slow approaches most, because a man could not spend long minutes near a mooring ring without drifting into a line or being lit by a launch. A decoded signal summary from the Mediterranean Intercept Room later in June noted terse enemy guidance to avoid harbors with inner belts and to prefer open roadstead targets. The system had changed where the enemy risked effort, mid-act, a contradiction forced refinement. In choppy weather, arrays near quay walls sometimes boomed against the stone and scared crews as much as swimmers. Small charges could also lift paint scales where ships lay very close, and in strong swell, trip lines sawed against their knots and broke. The fixes were workmanlike. Crews added short rubber stubs between the line and the wall to absorb slap. They wrapped knot points with canvas sleeves. They wrote a clear rule to slacken lines during any gale warning and to restore them in daylight. The die drill also got a tweak. Instead of 1 fixed throw each quarter hour, crews in complex tidal pockets made 2 small throws with half the volume, with the second landing a few paces behind the first. That pattern left a ladder a launch could read when the flood ran odd. The reliability numbers in pocketbooks ticked up again. False bursts dropped, reset times shrank, response times fell into a narrow band crews could plan around. By late June, the rollout had a rhythm. A typed circular from the commander-in-chief's staff laid out a standard set. 1 inner belt just inside each net gate, sleeves around any mooring with fuel-pumping gear, rattles only where outflows plagued watchers, die drills taught on day watches until a coxswain could hit a 10-pace square without looking. Aerial reconnaissance photos taken by Fleet Air Arm crews showed little. Dots on water, faint lines near quays. The telling images were in harbor photo albums kept by petty officers, close-ups of knots, floats, and the chalk marks on keystones where lines were meant to hang. The albums were witness objects as sure as any signal. They held the craft knowledge that kept the system from turning sloppy as crews rotated. A short American note appeared in July. At Oran, a U.S. Navy harbor party borrowed the idea and hung a short swimmer belt inside a net after a rumor of frogmen. Their after-action comment, passed back through liaison, called the belts cheap and quick and warned about over-tightening lines which increased false bursts when weed ran heavy. The variation rule held. The system adjusted to local water and local hands. Nobody claimed perfection, and nobody waited for a central kit. All through the act, numbers stayed small and human. 1 boom crew could hang 1 belt in a day, One launch could cover one belt well. Two belts needed a second launch or a tighter circuit. One charge needed one man to reset in less than a minute if the loops were pre-tied. The math drove planning. Harbors chose where to build sleeves first and where to live with the outer net a little longer. The opponent noticed. Reports of attacks in tight harbors dipped. Attempts at looser anchorages ticked up. The system had not ended the threat. It had moved it. The final piece of unmasking sat not in a memo, but in a drill board, leaning against a wall at Alexandria. It listed 6 steps with nails driven in as bullet points. Check knots, test 1 rattle, set fuses, run 1 die throw, log the time, reset anything spent. Each step had a time in chalk. Crews erased, adjusted, and wrote again. That board was crude, but it captured the doctrine's heart. The belts were not a weapon to show to visitors. They were a habit. They turned a swimmer's narrow path into a measurable, audible, and visible place, and they gave tired men on a wall something to hold on to besides hope. By the end of summer, the paper stack in the harbor offices told the story in dry lines. Pouch receipts, rail and ferry manifests for small stores, production tallies for shallow fuses, AAR pages with simple tables of bursts and responses, decoded summaries hinting at enemy caution. The system did not make headlines. It made logs, and it left the captured lieutenant's pencil marks copied into maintenance cards from 3 ports, his neat stagger of trip lines now standard. The shock had been local. The rollout was a craft spreading by mail, by habit, and by knots tied the same way from Gibraltar to Haifa. The first outcomes were local and plain to read in harbor paperwork. In Gibraltar, late March of 1943, the Boom Defense Office logged fewer unexplained surface slicks along the inner net and more recovered fragments that looked like tools, straps, and knife tips. The same week, Alexandria's watchbill shortened the response loop around the inner belts after crews proved they could reset a blown trip line in under 1 minute when loops were pre-tied. A unit AAR page filed before dawn and stamped with salt rings put the change in 1 line. No vessel touched at inner moorings during 4 consecutive nights with burst events. Oni. At Haifa, where Weed had made liars of the lines in May, the rattletins and the slight outboard shift cut false bursts sharply. A maintenance card showed fewer replacements and longer life for knots that carried small canvas sleeves. None of this looked dramatic. It looked like a system settling into habit. As the tempo of Allied moves rose in early summer, these quiet gains mattered. During the buildup to the Sicily landings in July of 1943, tankers and stores ships cycled through Grand Harbor at Malta, Alexandria's western arm, and smaller North African ports. The belt sat just inside the nets and, at Malta, in sleeves around the berths that mattered most. Logs show that launches used less fuel to chase fewer phantoms. A short production tally from Alexandria's ordnance shed marked steady issue of shallow fuses and tins at a rate the crews could sustain. A ferry manifest from Valletta recorded regular small deliveries of cord and floats to the breakwater cranes, never a surge, always enough for the next shift to tie and test. The opposing force did not stop trying. Intercepts summarized by the Mediterranean Signals Room in late June and again in July hinted that Decima MS teams were being told to avoid harbors with inner belts and to work at open anchorages where patrol lines were thinner. That matched what watchkeepers saw. Aerial reconnaissance photos from Fleet Air. Arm crews taken over a string of weeks showed little change near the inner walls, but more activity around anchorages beyond the moles. The belts had not erased the threat, they had displaced it to water where the geometry favored boats and guns rather than knots and tins. A measurable effect appeared in the pace of repairs. Before the belts, any swimmer scare set off wide, vague searches and hours of tense waiting. After the belts, a burst fixed a location. Launches cut across short found die or rattle confirmation and either recovered something or logged a clean check and cleared the lane. Reset time for a single trip line dropped into the span of a few breaths and a few arm lengths. Range tables clipped to sleeve plans at Malta recorded average response times halved around high-value moorings. Ships' log lines from a Polish destroyer at Alexandria and a Greek freighter at Haifa carried the same rhythm. Brief alarm, short response, no damage, lines reset, watches resumed. There were limits and costs. In choppy weather, shallow bursts slapped stone and painted small scars on key faces. In swell, lines sawed at knots unless crews used rubber stubs and canvas sleeves. Dye sometimes marked eddies in a way that mimicked a body. An after-action remark in a harbor AAR cautioned that dye drills should be taught with tide tables in hand, and that launches must learn the shape of each pocket's flow. A few nights, belts near tight berths were slacked for gales and restored at first light. None of this was a secret flaw, it was maintenance. The belts asked for attention, not miracles. The captured Italian remained a quiet presence behind the paper. He did not return to a dock, he moved to a regular prisoner compound under a different guard routine. The harbor files recorded him only as the hand behind a pencil sketch copied into many maintenance cards. His status stayed administrative, not celebratory. He was neither paraded nor punished in view of the pier. What he had given was technique, not allegiance. The crews used it because it worked. Across the summer and into autumn, patterns held. In ports that fitted belts or sleeves, no inner harbor sabotage succeeded. The Mediterranean intercept summaries suggested the swimmer units shifted focus to lightly held roadsteads and to targets that could be touched at anchor without nets or belts. In those places, other measures took weight. More patrol hours, more random searchlight arcs, and, where possible, simpler inshore obstructions. The belts did not solve the war at sea. They solved one geometry problem inside walls and around rings, and that freed launches and sentries to concentrate where knots could not reach. The operational ripple was time. Because response and reset were predictable, harbor officers could plan fueling and loading windows with fewer long, nervous pauses. A cargo tally from Grand Harbor showed tighter turnaround times for tankers in late July and early August as the Sicily convoys flowed. At Alexandria, a short note appended to the watch bill authorized one fewer inner loop circuit per hour during calm nights if belts and sleeves tested satisfactory at the start of the watch. Fuel saved was a few drums at a time. Across weeks it counted. A U.S. liaison note from Oran, where a small belt was fitted in July, called the belts cheap and quick, and warned only against over-tightening lines and weed. That tone was typical, plain, practical, and limited to the water in front of the quay. Doctrine hardened enough to travel. A typed circular from the commander-in-chief's staff set the standard. One belt just inside each net gate, sleeves around any berth with pumping gear or high-value cargo, rattles only in foul flow pockets, dye drills taught until a coxswain could hit a 10-pace box without looking at his hand. Training boards appeared in more than one harbor shed, nails for steps, chalk for times, erasures for refinements. The boards were not official publications, but they carried the craft. A stack of harbor photo album pages, close, clear images of knots, floats, and chalk marks, rode with pouch mail to places where the belts would next be tied. Those albums joined the other witness objects that stitched the story together. Unit AAR pages, ship's log lines, rail and ferry manifests for small stores, production tallies for shallow fuses, and decoded signal summaries that sketched the enemy's shift in tactics. By winter, the belts had a small postscript outside the Mediterranean. In a British home port with a history of swimmer rumors, a short inner line was tried near a fuel pier. The water was colder and the tide ran harder, so the lines were hung shorter and the dye drill used smaller throws more often. Results were modest, but matched the pattern. False bursts trimmed with better knots, one credible attempt deterred, no damage. The craft traveled because it depended on simple parts and local judgment rather than one factory or one kit. The end of the war at sea in Europe did not end the idea. In the early Cold War, navies wrote new manuals about harbor defense against combat swimmers. The parts changed. Better hydrophones listening for the rhythm of human kicks, small acoustic pingers, non-lethal flash charges that stunned more than harmed. But the belt logic remained. Forces hung narrow zones of detection and deterrence where a swimmer's path pinched to one depth and one line. Training films showed sleeves around high-value berths in clear water. A few manuals even taught dye drills for quick marking, though new lights and sonars soon did that work better. The belts of 1943 were present in these pages as a habit, a layout, a way to think. Trap the path, fix the point, shorten the response, reset fast. The legal and ethical questions lived in the margins, not the manuals. A captured enemy had drawn the first useful sketch. He had not been paraded or pressed to tie lines. He had been asked to explain a method and had done so. The war ended. He disappeared into the routine of camps and exchanges, a file number more than a name. The system he helped launch did not need his further hand once it was out in the harbors. Knots and drills moved faster than reputations. The belts were judged by logs, not by origin stories. The rule that broke in the spring of 1943 never returned in the same form. Harbor defense no longer meant only keeping steel hulls out. It meant shaping water for men. Sentries learned to read ditongues and rattle sounds the way they read wakes. Coxswains learned tight, timed cuts instead of broad, wasteful sweeps. Boom artificers spent more time on short loops and sleeves than on single long nets that tried to be everything at once. The opponent adjusted and survived elsewhere, but inside walls and around rings, a narrow, shallow lattice took away his best angles. The witness objects that carry this change are small and workmanlike. A unit AAR page from Alexandria that gives 2 lines to a burst, 1 to a die throw, and 1 to a reset. A ship's logline at Malta that notes a brief alarm in the recovery of knife fragments near a sleeve. A ferry manifest that lists tins, floats, and cord by crate on a morning run to the breakwater. A production tally in Alexandria's ordnance shed that tracks shallow fuses made in steady handfuls. A decoded signal summary that notes a nervous shift in enemy target advice. Together, they make an archive of a craft learned by hands and kept by habit. Years later, the South Mole at Gibraltar looks ordinary in morning light. The Levante comes and goes. The boom is long gone. The chalk marks on keystones have been painted over many times. No tins hang in the water. A cormorant sits on a ladder rung and watches an eddy turn without dye. The belts themselves were always temporary. The practice they taught, think like water, trap the path, measure the response, stayed. It became the next rule, written not as a boast but as a checklist that fits on a board leaning against a wall.